Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. Then to give you what I believe to be the 10 biggest storylines in college football going into this year. For me, part of this is a way to kind of get everybody who's been in basketball mode or NBA Finals mode or college basketball mode, just to kind of remember everything that happened last year and in the offseason, but then also to kind of look ahead to what the storylines are going to be. I know it's been a long time since we've really dived super deep into college football. This feels like a good time. I am giving you the cheat sheet for college football. That's what I'm here for, right? I do all the dirty work so you can sound smart at your summer cookouts, your barbecues, your pool days, whatever. So let's get into what I deem to be the 10 biggest storylines going into college football now a month from SEC Media Days. First of all, number one, drum roll please. I promise we won't do a drum roll for all of them. The number one biggest storyline in college football going into this year, in my opinion, is the team that is basically the biggest storyline going into every season, and that is the Alabama Crimson Tide. No, this is not a Nick Saban versus Jimbo thing. I promise we are done talking about that until the week of October 8th when Texas A&M travels to Alabama. But why I bring it up is because I think Alabama, as weird as it sounds, might be the most fascinating team in college football this year. Why is that? Well, first of all, it's easy to forget this now, but never forget that we had real doubts about Alabama during last season. Now, it's easy to remember they made the national championship game lose to Georgia, but never forget, this was a team that was not a quintessential Alabama team last season. This was a team that when you look at the second half of the year, they did not play great football. They played, they lose to Texas A&M, obviously, right? And then from there, and we talked about this during the season, one possession game against Tennessee going into the fourth quarter, they end up winning going away. 6-point win over LSU after LSU had fired Coach O, and Alabama had 6 yards rushing in that game. Arkansas, a 1-touchdown victory. Auburn, a multiple overtime victory just to get to the SEC championship game where everybody had given up, everybody picks Georgia, and then they shocked the world and beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. But leading up to it, everybody said this team's overrated, this isn't a vintage Alabama team. I talked about it on this show all the time. Well, they get to the national championship game, they beat Georgia in the SEC title game, they play Georgia again, and never forget, even though Georgia won, Alabama was up in the fourth quarter. And that happened in a game where they were completely beat up. Jamison Williams, their best wide receiver, their best skill position player, gets hurt early in the game, does not come back. John Mechie, their second best wide receiver, did not play in the game, got hurt in the college football semifinal against Cincinnati. They had multiple starting offensive linemen out. They had multiple defensive backs out that were important to what they did, and they still had a chance to beat Georgia. Just one problem, they didn't beat Georgia, and now they have all offseason to stew about the fact that they could have won the national championship, maybe should have won the national championship, and now I feel like we're getting a mini semi-revenge tour from Alabama this year. Now, it's one thing to have a chip on your shoulder, but here's the other thing. They got the best players in college football. They obviously have the reigning Heisman Trophy winner, Bryce Young. It goes without saying, the best offensive player in college football. The best defensive player in college football, Will Anderson. He is my preseason Heisman pick. I spent a significant amount of money on that future when I was in Vegas a few weeks ago. And on top of that, they have depth. They have experience on defense. Henry To'oTo'o at linebacker. Jordan Battle at safety. Eli Ricks comes over as corner from LSU. He transferred in. And then on offense, they revamped the entire skill position group through the transfer portal. Jahmyr Gibbs from Georgia Tech, Jermaine Burton from Georgia, Tyler Harrell from Louisville. And I look at this Alabama team and I say, okay, they're the most talented team in college football, with the best coach in college football, the best quarterback in college football, no disrespect, C.J. Stroud, the best defensive player in college football. They revamped through the portal, and they have a chip on their shoulder. Not to mention, by the way, they also have a very manageable schedule. If you've looked at it by Alabama standards, it's pretty manageable. Now, remember, they do play Texas in the out-of-conference. When we talk about biggest out-of-conference games, we will certainly get to that one. But they play at Texas. They play at Tennessee. But they also get Auburn at home. They also don't play Georgia or Florida from the East. They get Texas A&M at home. They get LSU on the road in a year where LSU has a first-year head coach and is certainly rebuilding. They get Ole Miss on the road in a year where Ole Miss is coming off 10 wins, but they lose their offensive coordinator and their defensive coordinator. So best coach, best talent, manageable schedule. I am just telling you, be very afraid of Alabama. The number 2 biggest question of the college football season going in, how about my dogs? Roar, 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 roar. Love my dogs. Here's the thing, though. What do they do for an encore? First national championship since 1980. I know a certain segment of the fan base is happy and thrilled, and they're still riding that high. But we know college football fans. College football fans don't ever settle. There's no 5-year grace period in college football. You won the national championship last year, Kirby. Now what do you got on your plate for 2022? And while I think the Georgia story is incredible. Made me look smart because I picked him in the preseason. But what I would also say, it's something I talked about when we talked about Arch Manning's recruitment last week. Georgia did get a lot of breaks along the way. And so why that's important to me is, like I said last week when it came to Arch Manning. You go back to last year, they got a lot of breaks. Florida goes through a coaching change. They don't get A&M, Alabama, LSU, or Ole Miss for that matter in the West crossover games. They beat a Clemson team that we didn't realize at the time was absolutely abominable, which we'll talk about Clemson in a minute. They get to the SEC championship game and they lose, where if that was a normal year and the Big 12 had a team good enough to be in the playoff and the ACC had Clemson good enough to be in the playoff, Georgia might not even get into the playoff last year. They do, and they get revenge. And to their credit, they take care of Alabama, win the national championship, obviously take care of Michigan in the semifinal. But there were a lot of breaks along the way, and my question for Georgia becomes, what if there aren't all those breaks along the way? And what about in a season where just the talent level is going to be a little bit down? Now, Georgia is right up there with Alabama in terms of best recruiting programs over the last 4, 5, 6 years. Georgia's backups were better than most teams' starters last year. I get all that, and even though we don't know the names at Georgia, they're going to be awesome. But I do think it's worth noting. You lost not only a lot off of a historic defense. I mean, you lost a ton. Remember, 5 first-round picks were selected from Georgia just off their defense. Let's see if I can name them all. Travon Walker, the number 1 overall pick, wasn't even one of the stars of that defense. Jordan Davis obviously went to the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm not going to name all 5. Devontae Wyatt, somebody else, Quay Walker, both went to the Packers, and Lewis Seen went to the Minnesota Vikings. I did that off the top of my head. I was going to try to Google it. Point being, they lose 5 first-rounders and the heart and soul of that defense, Nakobe Dean, a third-round pick, to the Philadelphia Eagles. And I sit there and say, I get that the talent level is higher at Georgia than pretty much anywhere in college football. But that is a lot to lose off of one team. What happens if you don't get the breaks? Obviously, the schedule, because it's the East, is pretty manageable. You look at who Georgia has to play this year. Obviously, we know that they're going to play Auburn every year, but Auburn's obviously, they're going through a lot of stuff with Brian Harsin, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is Georgia now, open with Oregon. They do get Florida on the neutral field, Tennessee at home, so it's not as though it's going to be a cakewalk. But you talk about the cross-division games in the SEC. Auburn at home, which is struggling, at Mississippi State, no A&M, no Alabama, no LSU, no Ole Miss, no Arkansas. And I sit there and say they're going to be good again. I guess just my question is, what happens if they don't get some of the breaks that they did last year? Are we back to Georgia being 11-1, 10-2, SEC East champ, but not quite national championship contender? That is what is most interesting to me. We'll get back to the SEC in a minute, but number 3 in terms of the most fascinating storylines for Aaron Torres in college football this year, let's go from the Southeast to the far West, and let's go to my hometown, my adopted hometown. I'm from Connecticut, obviously, of Los Angeles, California, where Lincoln Riley has arrived as the USC head football coach. And what I can tell you about this situation is this. I have lived in California now for 10 years. Got here in the summer of 2012. At that time, if you remember, that was the year, by the way, USC was coming off a 10-2 season. They came into the season number 1. They fell apart under Lane Kiffin. But I bring it up because I can legitimately say I've been in LA for 10 years. This, right now, this moment in time, is the most excitement I can ever remember for USC football. I would say it's the most excitement for any Pac-12 program since I have been here, and that includes Oregon when they were still competing for national championships. When I first moved here, I think my first year here was Chip Kelly's last year. Then, of course, they played for the first ever college football playoff title game where they lost to Ohio State. I still think the hype and excitement and intrigue for Lincoln Riley surpasses that. This is a historic program that we know when USC operates at the highest level, they're one of the few schools. They can build something to compete with Alabama, something to compete with Georgia, something to compete with Clemson, Ohio State. There aren't very many programs that you can say that about, right? Like Oregon's an incredible program. I don't know that even at their best they can ever really have a team that's literally player for player, position for position on par with Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, schools like that. USC can't. Now the question becomes, how soon can they do it, and what is realistic for this year? Now, in terms of what you need to know for this year, first of all, Lincoln Riley comes, but make no mistake, he brought a lot of talent with him. Obviously, Caleb Williams. I do think the Heisman hype is a little much for Caleb Williams. At some point in the summer, we'll do, realistic Heisman winners and unrealistic Heisman winners. I do think the Caleb Williams stuff is probably a little bit overblown right now. But Caleb Williams is still a superstar. And on top of that, you get Jordan Addison, the Biletnikoff winner, top wide receiver in college football. We certainly talked a ton about him. Remember, Travis Dye, a star running back from Oregon, transferred in. Mario Williams, one of the top wide receivers at Oklahoma, followed Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley to USC. I guess he followed Lincoln Riley because he committed before Caleb Williams, but you get the point. Latrell McCutcheon, star cornerback from Oklahoma, transfers to USC. There's some players along the defensive line. So this team's going to be really good right away. But again, the most interesting thing about USC is you don't bring Lincoln Riley to LA and you don't pay him somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million. I don't think we know the exact details. You don't pay him that much to just be good, to just be 10-2, to even just win the Pac-12. You bring him in to, as I said, build a program, a team that can compete with Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, Clemson, maybe Texas A&M at the highest levels of college football. And so I'm especially intrigued to see what happens this year, what is realistic and what isn't. Now, the Pac-12 is obviously the Pac-12, so there are wins to be had. And you can say what you want. Last year, listen, I don't even count last year with USC because of the fact that coaching change, whatever. But I bring it up because when you look at Clay Helton's track record, for as bad as Clay Helton was, I mean, these are his seasons. 10-3, 11-3, 5-7, which was a disaster, 8-5, and then 5-1 in a COVID year and played for the Pac-12 championship. So, even with, I don't even know how to say this delicately, but Clay Helton as the head coach, the floor is like 8-9 wins. How quickly can Lincoln, what is realistic for this year? I'm beating around the bush. Let me get right to it. The schedule is manageable. Now, it's not super easy. They don't play Oregon, but they do play late in the season. They play Notre Dame at home, who's obviously going to be good. They play at Utah, maybe the best team in the Pac-12 this year. No Oregon, as I said. I do think it's worth noting USC will play, obviously, UCLA at the end of the year. UCLA has a chance to actually be pretty good once again this year. So it's just going to be interesting. You look at the schedule, the 3 out-of-conference games in addition to Notre Dame are Fresno State and Rice at home. They should be at least 2-0 going into Pac-12 play. They play Stanford early. You look at the schedule. They could be 6-0 going into Utah. Even if they lose to Utah, they could be like 9-1 going into the final 2 weeks against UCLA and Notre Dame. And then final thought on USC, and we'll move on. It is worth noting, remember this, the Pac-12 a few weeks ago announced they are the first conference that is switching up their championship game. It used to be the North winner versus the South winner plays for the title. This year, it's just the top 2 teams. Divisions are out, and so can USC in year 1 get to that Pac-12 championship game? Can they get maybe to a Rose Bowl as the Pac-12 champion? Fascinating to watch. Really quickly, that was number 3. Number 4, on top of Lincoln Riley, how about all the other new coaches in new places? This is like, I don't think you can undersell how crazy the coaching carousel was. Think about so USC opens up, Lincoln Riley goes there. Here are the other jobs that open. Oklahoma obviously opened up, Lincoln Riley leaves, Brent Venables comes in. Brian Kelly goes to LSU. Marcus Freeman takes over for him at Notre Dame. Billy Napier is in at Florida for Dan Mullen. Mario Cristobal is in at Miami for Manny Diaz, and of course Dan Lanning, the Georgia defensive coordinator, now the head coach at Oregon. And so Lincoln Riley is a fascinating topic unto himself, but some of these head coaches, these new head coaches, are just fascinating to see how they do in year one. Obviously, let's just get into them one by one, but Marcus Freeman, Notre Dame, fascinating. I think you can argue he probably takes over the best situation. The culture's great. The roster remained mostly in staff, but again, intact, But again, why did Brian Kelly leave for LSU? It's because he didn't believe that you could build a national championship contender at Notre Dame. Marcus Freeman feels otherwise. He's recruiting at an insane level for the 2023 class. But I'll tell you what, we're going to find out how good this guy is because the schedule is not easy, starting in week 1, an opener at the Horseshoe. Good luck to Marcus Freeman on that. They also play Clemson throughout the season, and then late in the year, as I said, they play at USC. Beyond him, listen, Miami. Miami's another really interesting one because, first of all, Miami was 7-5. This wasn't a dumpster fire like USC, like LSU. They were pretty good last year, and remember, they bring back the best quarterback in the ACC in Tyler Van Dyke. Connecticut native, no big deal. So Miami, you look at their schedule. They do play at A&M early in the season in the out-of-conference. They do play Clemson late in the season at Clemson. But outside of that, it's a pretty manageable schedule. Mario Cristobal has come in. He has upgraded the talent. I don't think he gets quite the credit that Lincoln Riley does for how he has used the portal, but I don't think we can undersell how good the talent upgrade is, and the talent was pretty good already under Manny Diaz. So you look at Miami. I think it's realistic that we're talking about an 8-9 win team in year 1 under Mario Cristobal, and then it becomes, can he turn Miami into Miami, and much like Lincoln Riley, build a program that can one day compete with Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, schools like that. Beyond Notre Dame, beyond Miami, remember, Florida, new head coach, Billy Napier. Really fascinated by this guy. Coach's son, worked under Saban, actually worked under Dabo early in his career. He's taken over at Florida. But I will say this. He might be one that in the long term has a ton of success, but in the short term, it might not look good this year. They have a pretty tough schedule, starting with Utah at home in week 1. Woo! Good luck with that. You ain't bullying Kyle Whittingham's Utah Utes. Now, it's going to be hot in Gainesville. The weather might be a factor for those Utes. 2 Utes, all the Utes. But I'm just saying, that's a tough opener. This year, Florida has Texas A&M in their cross-division game. So they have to play Texas A&M and LSU. They obviously have Georgia. Tennessee is improving. So Florida's one. I like Billy Napier. I believe in the hire, but that one's going to be interesting to follow. I am not sold that he is going to be quite ready in year 1 or that this roster is ready in year 1. Staying in the SEC, kind of the same deal at LSU, right? Brian Kelly's in. Brian Kelly believes he can build a national title contender at LSU that he could not at Notre Dame. Well, we're about to find out, but I'm not sure that this is the year. Quarterback, just chaos. They have like 4 guys all competing for the job. Garrett Nussmeier, who was there last year. Who was there last year. Jaden Daniels, who I'm not a fan of. Miles Brennan, a player who was in the program but has been banged up year after year after year. And then on top of that, just the depth and the number of bodies in the program. Remember, this was a program that for their bowl game, they had like 42 players on the roster. Now, they did reload through the portal. I think they got 15, 16 guys similar to USC. But still, this feels like it's going to be a bigger rebuild than you realize. Now, the good thing is you're in one of the most richest talent areas in the country. Louisiana kids want to grow up playing for LSU, but it ain't going to be easy for Brian Kelly. And finally, another one that's just really interesting. And I just talked about the guy that left. But how about the guy that came in at Oklahoma? Remember, Brent Venables, the Clemson defensive coordinator, is now in as the head coach at Oklahoma. And on the one hand, I think, if you want to have your crimson and cream glasses on, you can sit there and say, look, we haven't had a defensive presence forever. Brent Venables brings that. And what I will say in Brent Venables' defense, the players appear to love him. I was reading all these articles. They just talk about the energy that he brings, the excitement that he brings. He gets them fired up just to be on the practice field. But he's got some tough shoes to fill. Lincoln Riley, for all the criticism, multiple Big 12 championships, multiple college football playoff appearances, Heisman trophies, best offenses in college football. What's Brent Venables' answer? Now, I will say on a positive with Brent Venables, I thought he did a really good job in the offseason kind of reshaping that offense. A lot of guys decided to stay. He brings in Jeff Lebby as his offensive coordinator. That was the offensive coordinator for Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin. He is going to put his stamp on this, and Dylan Gabriel, the quarterback at Oklahoma. Really fascinating to watch. Really excited to see. Let's get to number 5, then we'll take a quick break and come back for the next 5 of my 10 biggest storylines. Number 5, I just mentioned that Brent Venables left Clemson. He was the defensive coordinator, now at Oklahoma. Those Clemson Tigers are they are just fascinating from a narrative perspective, because remember, this was a team that by their standard was very disappointing last year. They did finish 10-3 overall, and Dabo did the spin zone of, we're the only program in America, or one of only 2 or 3 programs in America. We could have 10 wins and our fans are disappointed. But you did have 10 wins and your fans were disappointed, and the standard at Clemson is college football playoff appearances and ACC championship games, and he fell short. Now, the good news for Dabo is they had like a cataclysmic number of injuries last year. Everything that could go wrong did. They opened with Georgia. Much more, manageable schedule this year from the beginning. Obviously, you open with Georgia, but this year you open with Georgia Tech. But you do have to go to Notre Dame in the middle of the season. You do have an improved Florida State team on the road in the middle of the season. So it's not going to be easy. And then the other thing that I think you have to factor is a couple things. One, I mentioned they lost their defensive coordinator, Brent Venables. They lost their offensive coordinator, Tony Elliott. Obviously, those guys leave, and they bring other staff members with them. Tony Elliott, now the head coach at University of Virginia, if you'll remember. That's a lot of attrition on a coaching staff that hasn't had any attrition for years. So you have coaching attrition. You're coming off a disappointing season. You're a program, by the way, that really hasn't jumped into the transfer portal NIL world. Now, Clemson's taking care of their players like everybody else, but it's much more of the way it was supposed to be. Like they're not recruiting the way that Texas A&M is alleged to have recruited, the way that Texas may be allegedly recruiting. That's not who Clemson is, but they don't take transfers. They took one transfer this offseason. It was a quarterback who started his career at Clemson, left, and now is coming back. And I just don't know in 2022 if you can continue to run your program like that, especially, by the way, disappointing play at quarterback. DJ Uiagalelei last year, 55% completion percentage, 9 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. I'll be fascinated to see how long the leash is with him. Remember, this guy was not good last year. They have a 5-star Cade Klubnik behind him, and I will just be fascinated to see how patient people stay at Clemson with Dabo Swinney, who, of course, has built one of the great programs in college football. But this is kind of a swing year. You go 10-3 again this year, you go 9-4, whatever it is, I think we start having the conversation of, are Clemson's best days behind them?